Good evening and welcome once again to Historic Sotterley. We really are glad to have you here. I say that every time because it's true. We love opening the place up and we love welcoming people here who help us understand the history better. And that's something we need to be doing every day. It's our responsibility to know who we are and where we came from. And this People in Perspective series, I think, has done a great job. Catherine has put together just wonderful speakers and events and activities, and it's a joy to work with her. John Garrison Marks is a historian and writer whose work explores history, museums, and the ways Americans engage with the past. He's the author or editor of three books, and his work has appeared in the Washington Post, Times, Smithsonian Magazine, elsewhere. He tells me soon the Atlantic, right? His latest book, Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory, came out this year, explores how generations of Americans have thought and fought about slavery's place in George Washington's legacy over the past 250 years. Dr. Marks also serves as a senior staff member for the American Association for State and Local History. We rely on them for a lot of information and guidance and standards and ideas. So you're doing great work there. Um, he leads the research, leadership development, and special projects there, including 9 years of thinking, writing, and speaking about the U.S. semi-quincentennial. He earned his PhD in history from Rice University, and talking and walking around the site with him today has been insightful because he brings a different perspective to it. But what he's going to be talking about tonight is one of my special interests. So I've been anxiously awaiting this. And John, it's all yours.
Put this down here. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It is not lost on me that it is very hot outside. You could be doing anything. You could be sitting at home watching the World Cup in the air conditioning, and instead you are here with me, with us at this wonderful historic site to hear me talk about my book and talk about history. So I'm really grateful that you all made it out tonight. Thank you too to Scott and Catherine and everyone here at Historic Sotterley. I only got to see a tiny bit of the site today, but I can tell that it's a really incredible place, and I'm really glad to have been invited down here to speak. I always like to start my talks by talking about this image on the screen, which is on the cover of my book. I know if I don't address it right up front, it's all you'll be thinking about for the next 40 minutes, and you won't hear anything that I have to say. So this is an image. It's a piece of art by a contemporary artist named Titus Kaphar. And he does a lot of really fantastic work that really explores themes of memory and history, and especially historical erasure. And he has a whole series of images that are like this one. Some of his work is at the VMFA in Richmond for another month if you want to go out and see it. But this one in particular, as soon as I saw it, I knew that I wanted it to be the cover of my book. Because what it does is it takes this very kind of traditional 18th century portrait of George Washington, and over top of it is literally shredded and nailed. It's a mixed media kind of three-dimensional piece. So if you see it in person, this shredded document is literally nailed over top of Washington's face and hangs off the bottom of the canvas. And the document is a reproduction of the advertisement that George Washington placed in the newspaper when he was trying to recover Ona Judge, who had fled from her enslavement to George Washington in Philadelphia. And what I love about this image is that I feel like it does in one frame what it takes me the better part of 100,000 words to do, which is to ask us quite literally how we would see George Washington differently if we put the history of slavery front and center. So highly encourage you to check out his work because it's really amazing. The exhibit that's at the VMFA right now is some of his work on George Washington, along with 19th century artists' portraits of George Washington, kind of comparing them both. They both explore issues of slavery. But I want to start tonight in talking about these issues where all good stories about George Washington start, and that is in Portland, Oregon. On June 19th of 2020, there was a protest, a demonstration for racial justice in the city. After midnight, in a park in Portland, a group of people gathered to demand greater attention to the long history of racial injustice in the United States, to force us to reckon with the history of racial oppression in this country. And to do that, they really focused on a statue of George Washington as kind of the symbol of the deep roots of racial injustice in the United States. This statue had been erected in 1926 for the 150th anniversary of the United States. But for these demonstrators that night, it was really kind of a symbol of the deep roots of oppression in this country. And so a little bit after midnight, this group threw ropes up around the statue. They gave it a few big tugs, and the entire thing came crashing to the ground. After it fell down, after they brought it down, people defaced it. They spray painted it, as you can see here, with things like 1619 and slave owner. And the next day, one person who was a local Portland resident spoke to a journalist and kind of summed up the moment when he told her, "Yeah, he's the founder of the country, but 300 slaves is a lot of slaves." And as many of you, I'm sure, remember, that summer, there were similar demonstrations in cities all across the country. This real moment of racial reckoning took hold in communities. There were massive protests and movements and demonstrations from coast to coast in cities and small towns alike. And often these demonstrations came to focus on images and statues and monuments to George Washington. For these people, George Washington becomes this really important and powerful symbol for encouraging people and really demanding people focus on the deep roots of racial injustice in the United States. And so in places like Seattle and Baltimore and New York, protesters douse these statues with red paint. They spray paint things like slave owner and slave master and God Bless America with 3 Ks on them. They really try to focus and bring the public's focus onto George Washington as this symbol, as they try to draw greater attention to the history of slavery and its legacy in the present day. That summer, the New York Times columnist Charles Blow kind of summed up the moment and really kind of summed up the strident tone that was taken by these protesters when he wrote in the New York Times in a column titled "Yes, Even George Washington." He said, "On the issue of American slavery, I am an absolutist. Enslavers were amoral monsters. Slave owners should not be honored with monuments in public spaces." Many of you probably remember that summer, remember this moment. But I think it at least struck me how focused so many of these comments were on George Washington that I maybe didn't appreciate at the time. Predictably, all of this talk about George Washington drew the ire of some Americans, particularly of conservatives. And there was an almost immediate blowback to all of these demonstrations and to the destruction and defacing of George Washington statues. So, for example, the press secretary during the first Trump administration, Kayleigh McEnany, she said that the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, ought to be ashamed of herself for even suggesting that statues and monuments of Washington could benefit from some additional context that explored his history of enslavement. The conservative provocateur Dinesh D'Souza started a rumor on Facebook that said liberals were trying to have the Washington Monument removed. the world's largest, tallest stone structure, that they were trying to have it removed so that they could rewrite the history of Washington and of the nation however they saw fit. And really, I think some of what we've seen in the last year, year and a half, has kind of been a continuation of this pushback on the kinds of protest and the kinds of conversations that were started in the summer of 2020. So many of you may have seen over the course of the last 6 months or so the conversation about the President's House site in Philadelphia. This is right kind of on the corner of Independence National Historical Park. It is where George Washington lived while he was serving as president in Philadelphia. And for the last nearly 20 years, there's been an exhibit there that tells the story of the people that Washington enslaved while he was serving as president. But in 2025, because of a new executive order from President Trump that demanded the removal of any kind of history that disparaged famous Americans at federal history sites, this exhibit was removed in January of this year. And it's bad in its own right, but it's also, I think, important to understand it as a continuation of this longer conversation. You've seen it in other National Park Service sites. We've seen it in the Founders Museum and the Freedom Trucks that are currently going around the country. The way that they talk about George Washington does not acknowledge his involvement with slavery, does not acknowledge his deep history with this institution. And really, it tries to use Washington's history to tell a very specific and particular story about what the nation is and what it should mean to us today. All of this contentious conversation over the course of the last several years, the kind of vitriol and anger and controversy that has surrounded these discussions of George Washington and slavery, I think for a lot of people have really felt unprecedented, felt like this was finally the time where Americans were going to have this conversation. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, Americans have been struggling with how to understand this history, how to make sense of Washington's involvement with slavery and its place in his legacy for nearly the entirety of our history as a nation. Arguing about George Washington and slavery is essentially one of the oldest American traditions. We struggle to make sense of how he could be, at the same time, one of the most prolific enslavers in American history, but also the architect of one of the largest private emancipations to happen before the Civil War. And as a nation, we have endlessly debated slavery's place in Washington's legacy, endlessly talked about how we should understand his involvement with slavery today. And those debates, those conversations over time have really shaped and reshaped the way that we understand Washington. They have shaped our collective memory of George Washington and slavery. And what they make clear, and this is what I try to explain in the book, and I'll go into it in one particular way tonight, is that Americans have always viewed history not just as a window into another time, but also as a mirror that reflects our own, a way to understand the present. And they have used history in that way. And looking at this kind of long trajectory of how these conversations about Washington and slavery have developed really makes clear to me that today's controversies about our history are really profoundly shaped by our history in ways that we do not often recognize. And so what I try to do in my book and what I'll try to do in this talk tonight is hopefully to move us beyond this binary, move us beyond the conversation we have been having for more than 2 centuries about whether we should understand Washington as a hero or as a villain. And instead, I hope what it can do is to help foster a richer and more reflective conversation, both about Washington and about America and about who we are as a people. So that's what I'll try to endeavor to do tonight. And again, what I try to do in greater depth in my book. But before I get into that, I think it's important that we all kind of start on the same page about what Washington's involvement with slavery actually was. There are people on both sides of the political spectrum who would like to tell you that Washington's history with slavery was simple, but in fact, it was incredibly complex. On the one hand, Washington was actively involved in slavery for the entirety of his adult life. Even while he is serving as general of the Continental Army, even while he is serving as president, he never steps back from his active involvement in the institution of slavery, in the enslavement of other human beings. He buys and sells people as if they were property for the entirety of his involvement with slavery. At times, he sells enslaved people who he viewed as disobedient to the Caribbean as a punishment, where they would face a much shorter life and a much higher likelihood of death. He exploits the labor of enslaved people to build his personal wealth, which was substantial. He is one of the richest men in America when he dies. When enslaved people flee from slavery, when they try to emancipate themselves, he relentlessly pursues them. And in fact, he often writes expressing kind of dismay, feeling like he has been betrayed by these enslaved people, and he's not sure why they aren't more grateful for the things that he has done for them. I mean, just does not understand it. Right till the end of his life, he retains this incredibly dim view of the capacities of African-descended people to participate in democracy, to be citizens of the United States. In 1797, 2 years before he dies, he writes back from Philadelphia, where he's serving as president, to his estate manager at Mount Vernon. Washington's dissatisfied with how much work they are accomplishing, and he writes to his estate manager and says, "If the Negroes will not do their duty by fair means, they must be compelled to do it." And I don't think I have to explain in an 18th century context what compelling enslaved people to work harder entailed. And yet, Washington is regularly writing privately about his opposition to the institution of slavery and his own uneasiness with his involvement in it, especially in the decades after the American Revolution. He talks about how he is opposed to buying and selling human beings as you would cattle in the market, is how he put it. He writes to say that he is opposed to separating enslaved families, to separating husbands and wives, separating mothers from their children, which is something that happens all the time under American slavery. And in fact, he writes again and again about his support for gradual emancipation laws, about how he hopes that there will be laws put in place at the state level or from Congress to gradually phase out the institution of slavery. So, for example, in 1786, he writes a letter to his fellow revolutionary, Robert Morris. This is one of the most quoted Washington documents of all time. He says, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." Again, he expresses his desire to see Congress, quote, to see Congress adopt some measure, quote, "by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees." In another private letter, he writes to the Marquis de Lafayette, who had his own plans for abolishing slavery. And Washington tells Lafayette that these gradual emancipation laws that he hopes will be adopted in Virginia, in the Chesapeake, all over the United States, he says that they will help the nation avoid much inconvenience and mischief. He always does this privately. He never uses his status and his visibility and his power as president to advance these measures. And yet he is consistent in his writing about his own uneasiness with his involvement in slavery. He recognizes the hypocrisy that is inherent in leading a revolution dedicated to the idea of liberty and equality and enslaving people at the same time. And he regularly talks about his desire to see slavery ended in the United States. And so it's perhaps no surprise that at the end of his life, Washington frees the people that he enslaved in his last will and testament. So in the summer of 1799, Washington writes this will. In December of 1799, Washington dies. And in his will, he declares that all of the people that he enslaved and owned outright, 123 people, would be free after his death and after Martha Washington's death. So this is somewhat complicated, and I don't want to get us bogged down in 18th century property law as much as I know you all would love that. There were about more than 300 people enslaved at Mount Vernon when Washington died, but Washington only legally owned 123 of them. The rest of them were owned by the estate of Martha Washington's first husband. And so after Martha Washington died, those enslaved people would revert back to the other heirs of her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. But for generations, for the better part of 40 years, there are marriages and friendships and relationships that are crossing that line between the dower slaves effectively owned by Martha Washington and the enslaved people owned by George Washington. And so what Washington writes in his will is that he wants to avoid the pain and sorrow that will inevitably occur when those relationships are severed and 123 people are let into freedom while the rest remain enslaved. And so he says it's going to happen after both of their deaths when that can be put off no longer. But I think it's important that we kind of pause here and recognize what a big deal it is to free 123 people from slavery. Few people ever enslaved more people than George Washington, but even fewer ever emancipated as many people from slavery as George Washington. And in fact, this is unique among the founders from Virginia. None of the other Virginia presidents who enslaved people emancipated the people that they enslaved in mass. Even Thomas Jefferson, who tried to emancipate a couple of people, didn't even emancipate all of the members of his own family, all of the people that he had some kind of blood relationship to. And in fact, he dies indebted, and the vast majority of the people that he enslaved end up on the auction block after his death in 1826. And when Washington dies and when he puts this clause for emancipation into his will, it gets republished all across the country. It is in every newspaper in the country. It is put into pamphlets and sold. People are immediately trying to make a buck off George Washington's death. It is quintessentially American to see happen. Anyone with a printing press is trying to publish George Washington's will and sell it. And so everyone in America knew that George Washington freed the people that he enslaved. And yet there was hardly any kind of public conversation about it. And so these two sides of Washington's story with slavery, his lifetime of involvement in the institution and his private expressions of opposition to it, along with the Emancipation Clause of his will, are two parts that he never reconciled during his life. They existed side by side. And it would be great, right, if this was a redemption story, a clean line between being born into a world where Washington enslaved other people, where enslaving people of African descent was the norm. Then he leads a war dedicated to liberty and equality, comes to see the error of his ways, and in the end, frees the people that he enslaved. But that story is too neat, and it's just not how it happened. In fact, he does both of these things, expresses opposition and enslaves people right up until the very end. I think we see this most clearly in Philadelphia, in the story that the exhibit that's now been taken down tries to tell, which is that when Washington was president in Philadelphia, he is writing about his support for gradual abolition laws like Pennsylvania's. Pennsylvania passed a gradual abolition law in 1780, and they were the first state to do it. And one of the clauses in that law said that any enslaved person who found themselves in Pennsylvania for 6 months would be eligible to claim their freedom. When Washington becomes president, he comes to learn a lesson that many future presidents would learn, which is that this law would also apply to him, and that the people that he enslaved and brought to Pennsylvania would be eligible to claim their freedom. And so he develops this private scheme to rotate the people that he enslaved out of the state before they arrived at that 6-month point. He would bring them back to Virginia or would bring them across the river to New Jersey. And so at the very same moment that he is writing so supportively of gradual abolition laws, he is actively undermining those laws to make sure that they don't apply to the people that he personally enslaved. This is a deep and unresolvable ambiguity in Washington's legacy. And we struggle to understand what it should mean because these two parts of Washington are just utterly irreconcilable. He never did it during his life, and in the more than 200 years since his death, we haven't done much better. And so, as part of that struggle with what this should mean, we have been cherry picking from his history with slavery ever since. We lift up his enslavement, or we highlight his emancipation, or we just ignore the issue altogether, all to suit the needs of the current cultural and political moment. And those uses and manipulations of Washington's history is the story I try to tell in the book. And tonight I'll share just kind of one example of how this plays out. So the example I want to talk about is how both pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists during the 19th century, in the lead up to the Civil War, all invoke George Washington. And they do it in very different ways, often contradictory ways, that they all say that George Washington supports their position. Even among abolitionists, they don't agree on how best to use Washington's history with slavery to support their cause. You have some abolitionists who use this truly searing criticism of Washington to shine a light on the injustice of slavery and show how deeply rooted it is in American society. And yet you have other abolitionists who really praise Washington for his decision to free the people he enslaved in the end. And they effectively make the case that if George Washington saw fit to free the people that he enslaved, what could be more American than ending slavery? And really, we see this begin almost immediately after Washington's death. The first person to announce that Washington had freed the people that he enslaved was this man, Richard Allen, who was born into slavery, purchased his own freedom, moves to Philadelphia, and becomes one of the founders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first Black congregation in the United States. And after Washington dies, he delivers a sermon to his congregation of free and enslaved African Americans in South Philadelphia. And he tells them that they have peculiar cause to bemoan Washington's death, because his heart was not insensible to our sufferings. He goes on to explain that Washington's will demonstrates that Washington believed Black Americans had a right to liberty, and so, unblasted by the popular opinion of his fellow Southerners, Washington, quote, dared to do his duty and wipe off the only stain with which man could ever reproach him. He let the oppressed go free. So before Washington's will is even filed in the courthouse, Richard Allen is using this story almost immediately to try to frame Washington's legacy in a way that could make the case for Black freedom in the United States, could make the case for ending the institution of slavery. And we see this happen again and again in the fight over slavery in the decades that follow. So fast forward a little bit to the 1830s. This is something that John Quincy Adams is doing all of the time in his comments opposing slavery. So after his time as president, Quincy Adams goes back to represent Massachusetts in Congress. And in 1838, he tells an anti-slavery audience, quote, the slaveholders of the present day vainly resort to Washington's example as authority for holding slaves, but his authority is directly and most pointedly against them. He then goes on to add, George Washington was, in the broadest and most comprehensive sense of the word, an abolitionist. And he goes even further and says that Washington viewed the Declaration of Independence as an anti-slavery document, and that is why he felt compelled to free the people that he enslaved at the end of his life. And Quincy Adams is fascinating, and it's so fun to read these speeches because he is delivering some of these on the floor of Congress and basically trolling the Southern congressmen, especially those from Virginia. He baits them into these arguments about Washington and his legacy in order to give himself a platform to talk about his opposition to slavery and to raise the slavery issue on the floor of Congress. A decade later, in 1848, William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most famous and powerful abolitionists, he delivers a speech in Boston's Faneuil Hall, famously the site of many anti-slavery gatherings. And he tells this story of a will that he had encountered in a southern state that had been declared invalid. And the person who wrote it declared insane because of an emancipation clause in it. And so in this really dramatic moment, Garrison is on the stage in Faneuil Hall. There's a huge portrait of Washington that hangs to the left of the stage. And Garrison points and shouts to the audience. And he says, there is a man who was insane when he died. There stands George Washington, who by his will emancipated his slaves. And I think given the conversation of the last several years and where I started tonight, it can be jarring. It still is for me to see people with whom we agree on policy about the end of slavery talking about Washington's legacy in this way, lifting him up as this abolitionist. But the radical abolitionists in the 19th century do this again and again. But the deep irony of, especially of Garrison's comments praising Washington's emancipation, is that at the moment he's delivering them, Garrison's newspaper, the most prominent abolitionist newspaper in the country, The Liberator, is filled with criticisms of George Washington for his involvement in slavery. Abolitionists are time and again telling their audience that George Washington lived and died a slaveholder, or that he was a slaveholder to the day of his death. And these abolitionists know what they are doing in using these criticisms of Washington. You know, Washington was this incredibly revered figure. Think about how revered he is now, and imagine how revered he was in the 19th century when he was, there were still people who knew George Washington personally. And Garrison notes, he says, in America, it is far more unpopular and hazardous to arraign the conduct of Washington than to speak against Jesus Christ. So they are using these criticisms of Washington because they are going to stir up trouble, because they are going to push the issue of slavery into the forefront of public discourse. But beyond Garrison, some of the most radical criticisms came from this man. And this is an abolitionist named Parker Pillsbury. He went further than almost anyone in his criticisms of Washington. He criticized him not just as a slave owner or a slave holder, but he calls him a slave hunter because of his pursuit of Ona Judge after she escaped from slavery and his support of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law. He tells a crowd in the 1850s that Washington waited 8 years in blood to achieve his own liberty, and then went home, and to the day of his death drove hundreds of his fellow men to unpaid and unpitied toil. In fact, Pillsbury mocks his fellow abolitionists who talk about Washington's will and its emancipation in these reverential tones. He talks about the will saying it demanded that every child should drink the terrible sacrament of sweating, sorrow, and anguish, which the fathers and mothers had drunk if Washington or his widow should happen to outlive them, because the will said that they would be freed upon both of their deaths. And he goes further. He says he can think of no other example in which a deathbed repentance being so highly extolled. Later in 1858, he notes that if Washington should come down out of the clouds and become a slaveholder once again, before God, my country, and the world, I would pronounce him a traitor to the cause of freedom. And I always want to stop here and just emphasize how radical a statement like that is. Like if I went on the radio or TV or a podcast and called Washington a traitor to the cause of freedom today, people would get very, very mad at me, right? It would stir up a lot of trouble if someone said that. And so you can imagine the kind of trouble it stirs up in the 19th century when someone like Parker Pillsbury says it. In fact, some abolitionists are being run out of town for these comments. They are escaping mob violence because people are so incensed that they would criticize Washington in this way. And again, that is part of the reason that they are doing it. It is a rhetorical strategy that they are using. Because it is so radical, they know it's going to get reprinted in newspapers all over the country. People will be talking about these calls to end the institution of slavery. But some of these comments went even further than just criticisms of Washington. And in fact, they justify enslaved people actively using violence to overthrow the slave system. This is the worst nightmare of white Southerners. They are talking about how fearful they are of insurrection, of violence from the hands of enslaved people all the time. And abolitionists are saying that Washington's example would justify it. They essentially say that Washington led a violent revolution to overthrow tyranny from the crown, from Great Britain. And so surely enslaved people would be justified in using similar violence to overthrow their own enslavement. So Garrison, yet again, always at the center, in the 1850s, he says, if any men have a right to fight for liberty with deadly weapons, they are to be found on Southern plantations. In 1858, Garrison again says that if Washington and his compatriots were justified in taking up arms and wading through a sea of blood to obtain their own freedom, then by the same unbending rule of justice, those who are enslaved in our country today would also be justified in resorting to armed resistance and in breaking their chains over the heads of their oppressors. In 1859, the abolitionist Wendell Phillips says, suppose a slave tonight should cut his master's throat and burn down his dwelling. What name would you give to him? Phillips says, I would call him George Washington, carved in ebony. After the John Brown raid in 1859 at Harper's Ferry, you have lots of abolitionists writing letters into the Liberator praising John Brown as the new George Washington. One man writes from Washington, D.C., and says he walked around the city, saw all of these statues to George Washington, and says that they should all be torn down, and statues of John Brown, the true George Washington, should be put up in their stead. And what's really fascinating, I think, is that all of these approaches from abolitionists happen side by side. They were a diverse group, abolitionists were. They had different views. And so they cherry pick from Washington's history with slavery to advance the argument that they felt would best support their efforts to end slavery. Some of these claims were incredibly radical, but it was never really about understanding the history. They ruthlessly criticize Washington, they praise his emancipation, they use his leadership of the revolution to justify violence. They do whatever they thought would be most useful in that moment. It's not about understanding the history or getting people to see it more truthfully. And sometimes, like William Lloyd Garrison, they do all three of these things at the very same time, depending on the audience they're talking to or the context that they are speaking in. And yet, abolitionists aren't the only ones who are using Washington's legacy in this way. Pro-slavery Southerners, too, are constantly invoking George Washington to say that he would support their position defending the institution of slavery. So, for example, in 1850, Senator John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, he's still kicking. He's too old to read his speech himself. He has a younger colleague do it. But still, he is defending slavery in the Senate. And he calls George Washington an illustrious Southerner and says that he was one of us, a slaveholder and a planter. In 1854, another pro-slavery advocate says that General Washington, the father of his country, saw no crime and no peccadillo in holding slaves and making them work on his farm. And these calls, these invocations of Washington by pro-slavery Southerners become so frequent that in 1860, Abraham Lincoln feels like he has to address them, and he calls them sophistical contrivances. And as a side note, if you ever need a term for bullshit to use in polite company, sophistical contrivances is about as good of one as I've found. But he urges Americans to reject these claims by pro-slavery Southerners that Washington would support their position. He says that Southerners' invocations of Washington are imploring men to unsay what Washington said and to undo what Washington did. So like abolitionists, citing Washington's emancipation or ignoring his active involvement with slavery. Pro-slavery Southerners do the opposite. They say that if Washington engaged with slavery, then it must be justified. They ignore all of his statements opposing the institution of slavery, and they emphasize that his involvement in the institution makes it right and makes it something that the United States should continue. And this really comes to a head during the Civil War. So in 1862, the Confederacy inaugurates its permanent government in Richmond, Virginia. And they do it on February 22nd, 1862. They do it on George Washington's birthday, and they do it in front of this statue right here, a giant monument to George Washington. And lest all this symbolism go unnoticed, Confederate President Jefferson Davis says that they are carrying on the principles of our revolutionary fathers, and says that the day and the location was fitly associated with their cause, the cause of slavery. And so just like the justifications of violence, Confederate Southerners are saying that Washington fought a war to overthrow a tyrannical government, and Washington enslaved other people, and that is exactly what the Confederacy is trying to do. And so they put George Washington in the very middle of the seal of the Confederate States of America. They put him on currency. They put him on banknotes. They put his image in newspapers. They are regularly calling Washington's legacy with slavery into the fray to say that it justifies their position defending the institution, and it justifies their secession from the nation that Washington helped bring into the world. Now, all of this is based on these unbelievable ambiguities in Washington's history. And all of this ambiguity, these unresolved tensions that are at the heart of Washington's history with slavery, his status as both an enslaver and an emancipator made him this endlessly flexible symbol, one that Americans in the 19th century eagerly used, and one that Americans continue to use to make sense of their present circumstances. Americans have long tried to manipulate Washington's legacy of slavery to have it better support their points. But it's always grounded in this hopelessly narrow and selective reading of the evidence. It's never about truly understanding the history. It's always about winning the cultural and political battles of the day. And unfortunately, there just aren't any easy answers to what this should mean. It is just a unresolvable fact that Washington, the heroic founder, and Washington, the unrepentant enslaver, will always exist side by side. There is no way around that kind of ambiguity. But I genuinely think that there is real power in embracing and accepting that ambiguity. To do that, to sit with that ambiguity, is to recognize that America is not now and has never been just one thing to all people. There is no piece of evidence, no masterwork of history that is going to solve this challenge for us, that is going to make it make sense and give us one single answer once and for all. That kind of work, that kind of meaning making can only be done by us. Can only be done in rooms like this one, at historic sites like this one. And I know that that's a difficult thing to ask people to do, to sit with ambiguity in that way. Telling a new story about Washington and his involvement with slavery, viewing history in a new way or through a different lens, often demands that we tell a new story about what America is and about who we are as a people, particularly for those who have invested so much meaning in Washington and his legacy. And so I understand that that is not work to be taken lightly. But at this unique historical moment, just a couple of days from the 250th anniversary, I still think that we have a really rare chance to step back and to consider together what we want this history to mean to us now and where we want to go in the future. And through conversation with one another, through events like this, through places like historic Sotterley, by engaging in that kind of work together, I still believe that we can better understand the past's most challenging questions and use that process of collective reckoning to build a more just future. Thank you.
There's got to be some questions after that. That was an amazing and thought-provoking presentation. We've got some talking to do. So who has a question? That's okay. Yeah.
What happened to the enslaved woman that I guess she escaped from Philadelphia, right? That you mentioned?
Mhm. Yeah, she lives out her days in freedom. Washington tries for years to recapture her. He sends emissaries. She ends up in Rhode Island and then New Hampshire and sends people up there to try to find her and capture her. He makes clear that he doesn't want them to incite a riot or a mob in doing so. And ultimately, he's just unable to recapture her. And shortly before the end of her life, she gives this long interview to a New Hampshire newspaper, kind of telling her entire story. And that's the basis of a really incredible book that you could read in a day, called "Never Caught" by the historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar. People say this all the time. This is really true. It reads like fiction. It just goes. It's got a lot of narrative propulsion, as they say, and that really goes deep into Ona Judge's story. So highly recommend that one.
Thank you.
You said we're a couple of days away from 250 and that we still have an opportunity. I guess my question is, where are the people who really want to seek out this opportunity? I'm born and raised right here in this county, and I don't see them. I was raised with a lot of people, and when you start to talk about issues that are uncomfortable, everybody retreats to their own history, whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll say two things. One is that in survey research, anytime you ask Americans, what should history look like? Should it be, kind of just this inspiring story of the triumph of freedom, of just the good parts, or should it be this more expansive, complex story about all of it? And every time this is asked in surveys, it's always about between 2/3 and 3/4 of Americans say that they want the latter. They want the full story. They want to engage with the complexity. They want to be brought into the process. They want to see it kind of warts and all. And they know when they're not getting it. They know when they're getting a whitewashed or censored version. There happens to be a very powerful group of about 1/3 of Americans who are fully committed to a different project, think history should be something different. But I'm always encouraged that it is a huge majority of people who think that history should be this more expansive thing that explores both the good and the bad and all of the complexity in between. But I think your question also gets to the importance of places like museums and historic sites. I think a lot of people, even if fundamentally that's what they want out of history, is to explore all of it, they don't necessarily feel equipped with the tools and the knowledge to have that conversation just one-on-one with someone, or in a setting, just at dinner or out, when you bump into someone. And I think it's places like this, and museums and historic sites all over the country that can really kind of guide people through that process in a way that they won't otherwise experience, and can help people both understand the history and have these kinds of facilitated conversations about it, where you can understand how other people are viewing these questions, what kinds of emotions and ideas it sparks for them. And that work, I think, is really important. And so, like, I'm not surprised to hear that, what you're saying about people being kind of reticent to discuss painful histories or difficult histories. We see that a lot in survey research too, from people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds at that. But I think it really speaks to the importance of history organizations generally, but especially of local history organizations, where people feel like the museum or the historic site is telling their story and their community's story, that it really gets them. I genuinely think that it's in those kinds of places that we can make progress in having better conversations.
And I kind of want to add to that because, Alonzo, we do all kinds of great work here. Anecdotally, what we've seen is a lot of people are coming to sites like Sotterley and they're going, they're kind of like what I would call the toddler mentality of, okay, you're telling me, some sites are saying we can't talk about this history. We're going to pull it off the shelf. We're not going to display it. We're going to take down exhibits. And so they're coming here and they're going, I need to understand why before I make a decision on where I stand with that. And then they're leaving here with the perspective of, I had somebody tell me recently on a tour, they go, I don't get it. And I said, well, what is that? Explain that to me. And they said, we don't understand why you want to hide what's happened, because you can't undo it. You can't sweep it under a rug. And so what we're seeing are people coming out and seeking answers as to why things are happening at a national level that we're seeing with their federal museums and federal sites, because they want to understand, and it's actually bringing them to places like Sotterley, which, thanks to our descendant community, we have facilitated dialogue about, really having in-depth, holistic conversations about the past and warts and all history. And God bless people like members of the Briscoe family, as well as the Canes, who represent dual perspectives at Sotterley, for sitting down and having facilitated conversations with fourth graders, fifth graders, and eighth graders, which, that means there's no filter with these kids, and their questions and their perspectives on the past. So it is interesting to see what we're seeing at a national level trickle down to sites like ours.
Yeah, people will ask me sometimes, like, how do you have this conversation with kids? And it's so much easier to have this conversation with kids than it is to have it with adults. I have two little kids. They're 7 and 4. They're brothers. Let me tell you, they have an innate sense of things that are fair and not fair. And like that is something that, you lose over time. And as people age and become adults, they kind of get incorporated into some of these broader cultural conversations, and something that is very simple ends up looking very hard. But when you talk to little kids about slavery, they just say, that's not fair, that's wrong. And they kind of clock that immediately.
How many frank conversations of adults, maybe adults unlike us who don't have an already developed interest in this or a commitment, how many frank conversations do you think actually do happen, and how can we enhance those?
Yeah, certainly not as many as the people in this room would like. I think what some of the research that I've led at AASLH suggests is that there's an unfortunate number of people who see history not as something that is essential, but as a hobby akin to, model trains or pickleball. Like, that's good for you if that's the, going to historic sites is the kind of thing you're into, but not for me. And so I think it's important that people who are invested in history and recognize how important it is for understanding contemporary society, to be communicating for that, advocating for that, not just it can't just be in op-eds in the New York Times, right? I think people often overlook local media and local newspapers and having those conversations there, writing letters to the editor there to talk about the importance of history. And I think there are, we've found some ways that are especially effective for doing that. But it's ultimately it's a very it's a large number of people, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not the majority who are visiting museums and historic sites. And my hope for this anniversary all along has been that, and like I said, I've been working on it since 2017, almost a decade now. No one's looking forward to this weekend more than I am, to have it behind me once and for all. But my hope for years now has been that this anniversary would be an opportunity to reintroduce the American story to a much broader swath of people, maybe people who haven't updated their sense of what American history is since the bicentennial, and to be able to talk about and explore all of the complexity, all of the new things we have learned in the last 50 years. And I think there's been some missed opportunities at the national level to support that kind of work. But I've been really encouraged by all the incredible stuff that's happening at state organizations, at local organizations, to really try to use this anniversary and make the most of it.
Next question. Anybody have a question?
Thank you. I'm not sure I have this well thought out, but if you're, let's pretend that I'm uh, someone who's outraged by what might be criticism
Mhm.
of our venerable George Washington. Let's say that I have the point of view that you're just trying to tear down an American hero. What do you say to convince me in the role of, that you're not doing that, that you're showing that this is a human being and he was always a human being?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And you see it happen again and again, or at least in researching the book, I see it happen again and again, that there from the moment Washington dies and, is eulogized as first in the hearts of his countrymen all the way up till the present. There are people who express this kind of outrage at, that, people are trying to tear him down into the mud instead of marveling at his heights, right? And I think for one thing, the most basic explanation is that, like, I want to understand who he was. George Washington was a human being. And even that is controversial. There's a museum I spoke at in New York who did a small exhibit on this, and they had big text on the wall that said, George Washington was a human being who made mistakes, or something to that effect, or was a fallible human being. And there was a lot of pushback on using that text, just acknowledging that Washington was a human being. I think more than any other historical figure, Americans really struggle with that, to see him not as a symbol, but as a human being. In the book, I talk about the 1932 George Washington bicentennial, the commemoration of his 200th birthday. And one of the things I find so fascinating about it is that both white Americans and Black Americans, both Washington supporters and detractors, both all kind of have this sense that, like, the version of Washington that has arrived to them in 1932 is really kind of this mythologized fake version, and they both want to get back to the kind of what they call the real George Washington. But for most white Americans and for federal planners, that didn't involve talking about the institution the institution of slavery. And so what if people are still kind of not buying it when I say I just want to explore the entirety of his history, and that includes the history of slavery, I always like using a metaphor that the author Isabel Wilkerson uses. She wrote a great book about the Great Migration, The Warmth of Other Suns, and she also wrote a book that came out, gosh, that's probably 6-7 years ago now, called Caste. But in that book, she uses the metaphor of, appropriately for here, of a historic house. And she says, America is essentially this historic house, and we are the owners of it now. And it has, rot in the floorboards, and there are, leaks from the pipes in the walls. There are, problems with the foundation. And those problems weren't created by you and I. We just inherited this place. But ignoring them and continuing to act like they don't exist is only going to make things worse for the next generation who inherits this place. And so part of this work, I think, is acknowledging that things aren't going to get any better if we try to act like those problems aren't there underneath the floors or inside the walls. And what we want to do is get a sense of how bad things are, get a sense of what the reality is here, and then try to figure out what it will look like to address it. And that metaphor is one that I find tends to make sense for people, and one that I find particularly powerful.
Thank you. I think it's always important to consider that history should always be judged by the context of its time as well. And we talk about the obviously the importance of slavery in terms of the social aspect of it. That's the what. But sometimes I think we also need to we should include the how and the why. And I think a lot of times that's important to consider and mix it together, because not only do we have the social aspect of it, but we should also include the economic and even the religious aspect, all wrapped around the whole thing, instead of just identifying a particular one aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a tendency, as speaking broadly as Americans, to kind of make all of slavery in America into 1850s Mississippi, big cotton plantations, overseers kind of lording over them. But that is not the slavery of the 18th century Chesapeake, and that's not how how enslavers talked about it. And I think it's important to understand the ways that enslavement was different in the 18th century Chesapeake, and particularly in the ways that enslavers tried to justify their involvement in it. It's really not that remarkable that Washington expresses that his recognition of the hypocrisy of being part of this nation and holding these values of liberty and equality while also enslaving other people. He recognizes that this is wrong, that this is immoral, that this is a hypocritical stance. Jefferson says the same. He talks about how he worries about meeting his creator and the ultimate judgment of God for his involvement in this institution. But by the time you get to the 1820s, that has all disappeared, right? And by the time you get to the 1820s, 1830s, white Southerners, enslavers, are justifying slavery by saying that it is a positive good, both for Southern society and for the enslaved people themselves. And so those kinds of differences, I think, are really important to recognize and how slavery changes over time. But I also think, in thinking about understanding it in its own context, there are people who are writing to George Washington directly while he is alive, criticizing him for his involvement in slavery. Pennsylvania establishes its gradual abolition law in 1780 before Washington, is even done fighting the Revolution, let alone living in Philadelphia and serving as president. And so there were not to mention the actions of enslaved people themselves, the ways that free African Americans speak out against the institution, even in the 18th century. And so in Washington's time, during Washington's lifetime, there are all of these voices that are speaking out against the institution of slavery, that are raising the issue and pointing out how wrong it is. And so that was something that Washington recognized and had to grapple with too.
Anybody else? Well, John, thank you. This is thought-provoking, and that's what we need here. I don't want this to be necessarily a safe place for what you hear. I want it to be a safe place for what you can say. And we need honest dialogue. We need to be able to talk about these things. So thank you so much for coming. I want to just make a little announcement about this weekend. If you or any of your friends are coming to visit historic Sotterley, we're going to have to make some adjustments for the cold weather. No, for the heat. We're not going to have the regular tours because it's just going to be too hot inside the manor house. So we will have the interpreters and docents giving information in the air-conditioned visitor center, and then a visit to the manor house will be, by comparison, a fairly quick walkthrough for our visitors. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful 4th of July. We thank you for coming out, and I will remind you that you can find out about everything going on at Historic Sotterley on our website, sotterley.org, and find the events page there. We've got great things going on. And you can also support us there. You can donate through the website, or you can drop a check off to us at the office, however is convenient for you. But we do appreciate everyone's support, not just monetarily, but for you coming out to these great events that we have, because Catherine and our other staff put an awful lot of work into it, and I think the quality of it shows. So again, thank you. Have a very safe holiday, and no firecrackers. My cats don't like them.
Thank you all.